All right, everybody, this is about the second or third time I have tried this. We are having internet problems, and so I'm going to try a different format and see if we can make it through. All right, first thing you need to do is open up the link below and download either the Word format or the PDF format of this week's lesson, The Church and Its Commitments, 1 Timothy 2. While you are doing that, I want to thank you. You guys are doing a really, really good job updating your pictures and getting those in the system for us. I really need you to keep pushing on that, and let's get as many of those as we can. That is such an asset to those of us that work on the staff, especially as we minister to people. Being able to match their face with the name is a huge help when we're walking into hospital rooms and homes and things like that. So that really, really helps us. I want you to keep working, even though Don Roth and Vince Flamini actually have already won the competition. In fact, they wrapped it up, I believe it was last Monday. And we actually had two or three classes very quickly in successive order messaging me that they were done. But Don and Vince were first, so I'll be taking them to dinner next week. We had Jay and Danny, Jay Jordan, Danny Poston were literally within a couple of hours of wrapping up of Don and Vince. And then I think Jim Harsh and Ray have almost wrapped theirs up. Young Mary's wrapped up. College, I believe, is wrapped up. So we're making good progress. And but I appreciate you. Keep working on that, and we'll get that done very, very soon. Now let's talk about this lesson, the church and its commitments. 1 Timothy chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed teaching chapter 1. It was a really good chapter. Um, Here's something a little different that I did with this lesson than what Jerry Vines put in the material. He says at the very beginning of the material that even though this is there's sort of two sections in there, about the prayer and about the women, that he's taking and making the whole lesson geared towards women. So he's talking about godly women pray and that type of thing. For me, I think it's sort of nature of the beast when you're committed to taking a chapter a week. They may not, everything in that chapter may not just seamlessly go together. And I think this is one of those chapters. You have a definite section in verses 1 through 8 that is imploring everyone in the church, Christians, to be prayer warriors, to be people that pray faithfully for other people. And then there's an entire other section there on women. So I think it's just, for me personally, teaching this lesson, um, keeping those two things separately, so that we're going to talk about how an effective church prays, and then we're going to talk about God's characteristics for godly, righteous women. All right, so that's what I've done in this. So point number one has really nothing to do with women, except if you're a women Christian, you ought to be somebody who prays. All right, so I'm not trying to get a continuity like Jerry was of the entire lesson points, and I think that's okay. I mean, I think you got to take the paragraphs in the original language and the subject matters as independent of each other. And so that's what I've done. All right. So we're looking at this chapter. If you want to look at point number one, an effective church prays. Now, a lot of this, as I was reviewing this, I worked on this a couple of weeks ago, but as I was reviewing it this morning, boy, it is so appropriate with what Pastor Monroe was preaching on yesterday in the morning and evening service. So Paul begins the chapter with a call to prayer, and he addresses these different aspects. So he talks about who are we to pray for? Well, we're to pray for every kind of person, right? For all men, there's the phrase. And of course, that doesn't mean you pray for every single person you know, but it's a command to pray for every kind of person. We're to pray for one another. All right, that's obvious. That's obvious there in that context. And then he specifically instructs us to pray for kings and all those in authority. Now, I think this is just an amazing thought, and I put it in the lesson here. It's a fascinating command when you consider who was the leader when Paul wrote this. They were ministering under the rule of the Roman Emperor Nero. And Nero was ruthless in his persecution of Christian believers. So for him to say, I want you to pray for them, would have probably been a shocking thought when those people first heard what Paul was asking them to do. We're to pray for the people that we were supposedly suffering under. So what does that mean? That means we're to pray for people we don't agree with. Well, we've got a lot of practical application for this point. Now, you got to be careful. I don't want you to go down a rabbit trail and rehearse all the bad leaders that we have. Most of the people that come to your class probably already know that, and we don't need to depress them out of their minds as we remind them of who's the president and who's the vice president and all the stuff that's happening and all that kind of stuff. We don't need to do that. We're supposed to make the point that we got to pray for them. We got to pray for them sincerely. All right. We don't pray for them to, drop dead of a heart attack or something like that. No, we pray for them as they lead. We pray for their salvation. Jesus died for them just like he died for you and me. And verse 3 clearly says, this is the will of God. So we've got to do it. We can't ignore it, right? We can't be, if we're not praying for the leaders that we disagree with, then we're out of the will of God. So what are we to pray for them? That's letter C, verse 2. We're to pray for the leaders in such a way that promotes peace and enables the church to flourish. All right. Pastor said this I think it was last night or it was yesterday morning, but he went through the reasoning with us where when the authorities, the government authorities are not allowing us to operate freely, then we can't proclaim the gospel as freely. And the gospel is what people have to be saved. So we want to pray for government conditions that allow the gospel to thrive and be proclaimed freely. All right. So why are we to pray like this? Verses 3-7, because God desires the salvation of all people. All right. That blows Calvinism out of the water, right? There's no limited atonement. Jesus died for everyone. And because there's only one way for mankind to have salvation through Jesus Christ, that's why we're supposed to pray like that. We're supposed to proclaim the gospel to all men in all places. And just like what Pastor talked about last night in the book of Acts, we're to pray in confidence, and then we're to go out and preach or speak the gospel with boldness. I think there's a huge point in verse 8. Our purity, our holiness, our holy hands, our clean hands. What Pastor said, I got this from his message a couple of weeks ago. As George Mueller taught, we're to seek to get our hearts in a state where it has no will of its own. Right? That's easier said than done. So tons of application there, right? How's your prayer life? Who do you pray for? Who do you not pray for? All right? Who do you need to add to your prayer list? All right. So that's a huge, huge thing. Then the second half of the lesson, Paul turns his attention to the women, specifically the women professing godliness or godly women. And he's asking the question, what does a godly woman look like? Now, this is such an applicable question because we live in a culture that is obsessed with appearance. When you look at social media, for example, everyone on social media posts their best side, right? They post their best life. They don't post the ugly parts. They don't post the conflicts. I always get on my young mothers in my young married department because they would post so many pictures of their kids, you would make them think that their kid never cries or never gets dirty, right? And they don't post those pictures, right? They just post the good pictures, right? And we're obsessed with appearance. We're obsessed with people thinking we have it all together. And in a very indirect way and sometimes direct way, we've been trained and conditioned by the culture that in the way we appear and the way we present ourselves, whether that's physically or intellectually or emotionally, is to draw attention to ourselves. Now, what I put here in letter A for you, I think is some really important stuff because I think, and this is a great way to teach people how to study the scriptures. Every text has a context, right? And you have to understand and appreciate the context if you want to get the most out of the text. So what we learn as we study 1st and 2nd Timothy is that this church in Ephesus had problems, and it involved some women. For chapter 4, for example, teachers were encouraging men and women not to marry. All right, that impacts women, right? Therefore, undercutting the beauty of marriage. Chapter 5, younger women were not getting married, but they were spending a lot of time gossiping in the church. 2 Timothy, we find a group of women who were giving into false teaching and living according to worldly passions. So what we have in Ephesus is a problem with some of the women undercutting godly doctrine, godly behavior, and godly leadership. Now, also, I think it's important to point out the balance here. Paul hits it all. He just spent the entire chapter 1 railing against men who are teaching false doctrine. So he's an equal opportunity offender. And I think that's important to point out. God, The world goes crazy when we talk about Ephesians 5, where it tells women to submit themselves to their husband. And then we just completely ignore what God told the men to do. And did God give women a high standard to live up to? Absolutely. Did he give men a high standard? Absolutely, right? So Paul is an equal opportunity offender. I like that phrase. And if you read long enough, everybody's toes get crushed. Okay? So he talks about her style, all right, in verse 9 and 10. What is attractive? Women are to adorn themselves with modest apparel. The Bible, when it comes to women's dress, the word to always remember is modest or modesty. And what that means is, one, two, three here, the women's dress should not seek to promote herself. So see, we're back to drawing attention to ourselves, or look at number 3, I even put it in italicized font there because I want you to see it. A godly woman is trying to point people's eyes to Jesus, not themselves. So Paul's making this contrast between inner beauty and outer beauty. And what's so beautiful about that is the world puts all this stress on the outward appearance of a woman to where many women and men as well can feel inferior because they don't have the outward appearance that the world approves on. Isn't it wonderful that when we come to God, God doesn't judge us completely on the outward appearance. He judges us on what's going on in our hearts. And we all come to him the same way. What's appropriate on a godly woman, what looks good on a godly woman is good works. All right. And if we would focus more on our works and our servant mentality instead of our physical beauty, that doesn't mean we ignore our physical appearance, that we don't take care of ourselves and we let ourselves, go to pieces. Obviously, it doesn't mean that. But we put the emphasis where God puts the emphasis. All right. Then he talks about her silence. And remember, context again, he's specifically referring to conducting public services for the church. And what we see is a pattern in both the home and the church that leadership responsibility is placed in the hands of men. And it's important to recognize, again, and some of you ladies are going to be teaching this, so you can point out the obvious, right? It's important to recognize Paul didn't forbid all women from doing any kind of teaching in the church, but they do so under the authority of the pastor, who is always male. And then safety there, you can read that and explain that. Just point out, it's not talking about when he says shall be saved to salvation of her soul, but is referring to fulfillment, safety. And I'm always reminded, I'm drawn back to this idea. One of my favorite passages is Deuteronomy 10, and I think it's verses 11 and 12, where Paul, or when Paul there, it was Moses, and God is speaking through Moses, and he lists these things. How do we serve God? And he lists 4 or 5 things, and he gets to the end of that, and he says, you do this because it's for your good. It's for your happiness and fulfillment and contentment to follow God's plan. God created the world, and God created the structure and the organization for how the world functions best that will produce happiness, contentment, and fulfillment in our lives. And when we don't face that, it's because we're not conforming to God's plan. And when we conform to God's plan, we get those benefits. All right. So, application. How do you begin to apply 2 Timothy 2 in our daily lives? All right. Obviously, if I'm teaching a men's class, we're probably going to spend more time on prayer. We're probably going to spend a little bit more time there in a men's class talking about how do we encourage our wives in this? Right? How do we encourage them in this? How do we exhort them to follow God's plan? How do we compliment them in such ways that would encourage them to follow that idea of what real beauty is? Right? What do you like about the chapter? What do you not like about the chapter? What's one thing you can do this week to remember what we've discussed? Hope that helps you, and it's a great lesson. Hope it helps you, and we'll be talking soon, okay? If you need anything from me this week, I'll be here. Just give me a call, shoot me a text, an email, whatever. I'll do anything I can to help you and serve you this week as we prepare for another wonderful Sunday. God bless you. Have a great week.